Hey guys, tonight we step on to the Giza Plateau, with the air cooling fast, the sand turning dark like sifted cocoa, and the silhouettes of the pyramids rising ahead of you like three quiet mountains that never learned how to blink. You can almost hear the desert working grain by grain, polishing the stones in the moonlight. Most historians agree that these monuments belong to Egypt's old kingdom, but the story around them still has soft edges, places where the light fades and the questions begin. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We're going to use cautious words tonight because the pyramids might suggest a lot. They may hint at older habits of building, and historians debate what certain clues really mean. And look, you probably won't survive this journey if you expect ancient construction to feel like a simple weekend DIY project with one tiny Allen wrench and a cheerful instruction booklet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from while we wander around in the dark together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of the plateau, and the first thing you notice is not mystery, it's scale. The pyramids don't look like clever props. They look like decisions made in stone, the kind of decision that takes a society, not just a ruler, to carry it through. Archaeology suggests that the Great Pyramid was built for Pharaoh Khufu during the 4th dynasty, and that puts you roughly in the neighborhood of the mid-3rd millennium BCE, when Egypt is already a unified state, with an administration that can count, feed, direct, and discipline tens of thousands of people without losing the plot. You can feel the ground under your shoes, uneven limestone, with pockets of ancient debris and the faint crunch of sand. The evidence we do have points to this place being chosen carefully. A limestone ridge close to the Nile floodplain, near quarries, near water routes, near the lifeline of an entire civilization. In other words, if you were going to build a stone mountain, you picked a spot where your supply chain doesn't immediately collapse into a sad pile of dropped tools. And yet, the moment you let that mainstream foundation settle, another thought slides in quietly, like a cat into a warm laundry basket. One interpretation is that the plateau may have been prepared earlier than the big royal projects we usually talk about. Not the pyramids themselves, not a complete lost city under the sand, but something simpler and more realistic paths. Graded stone routes, tested work zones, cleared, maybe small structures, or shrines that don't survive well, when later builders arrive with the ancient version of a bulldozer, which is to say, 1,000 men with purpose. It's possible that early dynastic or even pre-dynastic communities already understood this landscape, already used it, already marked it in ways that would be hard to recognize now. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it is thin. But the plateau has that feel, the feel of a place that didn't start, being important on the day a pharaoh snapped his fingers and said, "Okay, boys, time to build geometry." You start walking. Your footsteps make that soft, dragging sound that only desert ground makes, like you're erasing your own footprints as you create them. A breeze slides past your face, dry and a little dusty, carrying a smell that's part limestone, part sand, part time. You keep glancing up because the angles are so clean. They almost look modern, like someone drew them with a ruler against the sky. Most historians agree that the pyramids were not built by enslaved masses in the way older pop culture sometimes claims, but by organized labor forces, including skilled workers and rotating teams. Archaeology suggests there were worker settlements nearby with bakeries, beer production, and evidence of medical care. That's the documented ground. It's not romantic, but it's impressive in a different way, the pyramids as the visible tip of a logistical iceberg. Now, a careful reading might suggest something else alongside that. If a state can organize that kind of workforce, it probably has deep roots of planning and measurement already in place. Not magical secrets, not alien manuals, but institutional memory. Systems, lists, training. People who know how to keep everyone from wandering off to start an impromptu drum circle halfway through moving a 2-ton block. And what if just for a moment you let your imagination play gently without turning it into a conclusion? What if you're hearing echoes of earlier builders in the way the stones sit, the way the ground seems already tamed? What if the real mystery isn't an impossible technology, but an older tradition of planning that doesn't leave glamorous traces? You stop looking at the dark line where the base meets the earth. The Great Pyramid is especially good at making you feel small in a very calm way, like a quiet reminder that humans have always been capable of big things when they commit to them. And you think about the rule in the title, that sense that something repeats something, feels consistent, like a blueprint that keeps showing up. One mainstream safe anchor is that ancient Egyptians were excellent surveyors for their time, using tools like plumb bobs, leveling methods, and careful observation. Archaeology suggests they could establish straight lines and right angles with surprising precision, even if the exact procedures are still a topic of study. You picture a simple plumb line, a weight on a string swinging gently in the still air. It's almost funny in a sleepy way to imagine that the most intimidating monument on Earth might depend on the same physics as a kid's homemade pendulum. You can build a wonder, but gravity still gets a vote. A popular rumor claims that the Great Pyramid hides a coded map of the heavens, or an advanced formula that only modern science can decode. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has staying power because humans love a secret. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some numbers and alignments are interesting, and some are likely the result of pattern-hungry brains, including ours staring too long at triangles and deciding they must be whispering. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Yes, there are genuine alignments and measured choices that look intentional, and there are also interpretations that drift into certainty too fast. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You keep walking, and the desert does its quiet work on you. Your breathing slows. The fan hum from your room, if you've got one, running blends perfectly with the imagined wind on the plateau, and your mind starts to accept that tonight is not about proving anything. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And right here, under the shadow line, you meet the phrase that always belongs in this story. Historians still argue whether the planning behind Giza reflects a single burst of 4th Dynasty genius, or a longer buildup of techniques and sacred landscape choices that began earlier than the biggest stones. That debate matters because it gives you permission to hold more than one idea at once. What's broadly accepted is that the pyramids are products of Old Kingdom Egypt, built in a time of strong central authority and religious focus. One interpretation is that the confidence of the project implies training and traditions stretching back maybe through earlier dynasties, maybe through pre-dynastic communities that learned the river, the stone, the sky. And then, because this is bedtime history, you let yourself float into a calm what if without turning it into a headline. What if some part of the plateau's story is older than the names we remember? What if the earliest builders aren't a lost super civilization, but simply people whose records didn't survive, whose mud brick crumbled, whose campsites became dust, while the later stone mountains stayed? You glance back once, just a little, as if you might catch the desert changing its mind. But the pyramids don't move. They wait. They always wait. The night makes them feel less like tourist icons and more like quiet witnesses. And as you keep walking forward, you realize you're not chasing a single answer. You're learning how to listen to a place that keeps its secrets by being older than your questions. Your feet keep that slow, sandy rhythm as you drift closer, and now you start noticing the less glamorous details, the parts that don't end up on postcards. The ground is scattered with small stones, chips, and rough edges, like the plateau is still shedding tiny pieces of itself after thousands of years. The pyramids loom above you, but your attention is pulled down to the human level, to the evidence that people did this with hand sweat, patience, and a lot of very strong opinions about project deadlines. Most historians agree that the Fourth Dynasty builders had real practical tools: copper chisels, stone pounders, wooden sledges, rope and levers, plus an obsession with measurement that would make a modern engineer nod approvingly and then immediately ask for a nap. Archaeology suggests quarry marks, tool traces, and work patterns consistent with large teams shaping and moving limestone blocks. The evidence we do have points to a highly organized operation, not an impossible one. If you've ever tried to move a couch up a staircase with one friend who keeps saying pivot, you already understand the emotional core of pyramid construction. You step into the Great Pyramid's shadow, and it feels like walking under a giant silent sail. The air cools a little, and this is where you begin to appreciate the difference between a myth and a method. A myth says someone snapped their fingers and the stones rose. A method says someone argued about angles for weeks. Someone measured again because they didn't trust the first measurement, and someone probably dropped a chisel and blamed it on a bad omen to avoid admitting they were tired. Archaeology suggests that the Egyptians used a standardized measuring system, including the royal cubit, and that they could keep lines straight over long distances. What's broadly accepted is that they could create accurate right angles using simple geometry and careful observation. The evidence we do have points to intentional planning, not random piling. One mainstream safe anchor is that they likely relied on leveling techniques and plumb lines plus sighting methods using stars or the sun, because the horizon is a pretty reliable reference when you're standing in an open desert with nothing to block your view except your own doubt. And yet, even on solid ground, you feel the questions. Historians still argue whether the exact techniques for alignment and leveling were primarily astronomical or primarily practical, with astronomy serving as a ceremonial layer over straightforward surveying. That argument isn't a crisis. It's a reminder that ancient builders didn't leave behind step-by-step instruction manuals titled "How to Build a Pyramid Without Getting Sand in Your Sandwich." A careful reading might suggest that the biggest mystery isn't that they used clever tools, but that they used them consistently at scale over years. That kind of consistency implies training shared standards and experienced supervisors who knew how to correct mistakes early. It's possible that some of these methods were inherited from earlier building traditions, not necessarily from a civilization before Egypt in the dramatic Atlantis on a lanyard sense, but from earlier Egyptian communities, learning what works, passing it down, refining it, and gradually creating a culture where precision becomes normal. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When people say before Egypt, it can sound like a completely separate lost civilization. But Archaeology suggests continuity from pre-dynastic communities into the early dynasties and then into the Old Kingdom. So, a more cautious explanation could be that what came before is not a different people, but earlier stages of the same people building skills long before they built stone mountains. You reach down and pick up a small pebble. It's nothing special, just limestone pale even in the moonlight. But it reminds you that every block was once part of something bigger, and someone had to decide where to cut. The very idea of cutting stone into usable shapes by hand, day after day, is both boring and incredible, which is basically the exact vibe we're going for tonight. Now your mind drifts toward the rumor shelf, the section of the human brain that loves a good whispered claim. A popular rumor claims that the Great Pyramid's precision is impossible without advanced lost technology. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it stays popular because it's emotionally satisfying. It turns hard work into a secret. It turns logistics into a conspiracy. It turns sweaty labor into a magic trick. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still be interesting as a question. Could there have been knowledge that didn't survive in written form? But if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for advanced lost technology, the evidence is thin. The documented record points more strongly to human ingenuity, working with simple tools and careful systems. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, like the exact step-by-step techniques used on specific days, or the tiny decisions that never got carved into stone, because nobody thought future people would obsess over them while lying in bed listening to a sleepy narrator. You keep that pebble in your palm as you walk a small motif you can carry forward. It's smooth on one side, rough on the other, like the story itself, some surfaces polished by evidence, others jagged with uncertainty. Archaeology suggests ramps were used in moving blocks, but scholars continue to debate what kind of ramps, where they were placed, and how they changed as the pyramid rose. Some models propose long, straight ramps, others propose zigzagging ramps, and others suggest internal ramp possibilities. To be clear, this is debated. But it's also a very human debate because it's basically the ancient version of arguing about whether you should carry groceries in 10 trips or just do one heroic trip and risk dropping everything in the driveway. One interpretation is that the complexity of ramp questions hints at multiple solutions used over time rather than one perfect system. A more cautious explanation could be that builders adapted on the fly, reworking methods as the structure grew. And what if in the quiet moments between shifts, workers shared tricks learned from older projects from earlier dynasties, or from communities that built massive tombs in mud, brick, and stone long before Giza's skyline became iconic? You pause and picture it, a foreman with a sunburned face, a rope in his hands, showing a younger worker how to keep tension steady. A plumb line dangling, swinging, settling, pointing down like an arrow that never gets tired. The simplest tool doing the same job it does in your world, telling you what straight means. What's broadly accepted is that much of the pyramid's outer casing is gone now, and what you see is the rough core. But the original would have been smoother, brighter, reflecting sunlight, maybe even glowing at dawn. It's possible that the gleaming surface made the monument feel even more otherworldly. And what if when the casing stones were new, the whole thing looked less like a ruin and more like a deliberate machine of light designed to catch the sky? You realize your shoulders have relaxed. The pyramid is still enormous, but it no longer feels supernatural. It feels like the product of a civilization that learned to be stubborn, to measure carefully, to coordinate thousands of lives toward one shape. And that's where a different kind of mystery lives, not in impossible technology, but in the human ability to build something so vast with nothing more than basic tools and a shared belief that it mattered. As you walk along the base, you let the question linger in its safest form. What if the methods used here are the peak of a tradition that began earlier than we can clearly see? Not a hidden truth, a puzzle, an open question, a debated interpretation, and in the quiet, the plumb line in your imagination keeps swaying, then settling, then swaying again, like the story itself, always returning to gravity, always returning to Earth. You keep moving along the limestone ridge, and the night air feels a little drier here, as if the plateau itself is quietly insisting on its own rules. The sand thins in places, and the bedrock shows through like an old knuckle pushing up from beneath a blanket. When you look closely, Giza doesn't feel like a random patch of desert where someone happened to drop 3 pyramids. It feels selected, tested, and prepared the way a carpenter taps a beam before deciding it can hold weight. Most historians agree that the builders chose Giza because it offered solid limestone foundations near the Nile's transportation routes and the quarries that supplied much of the stone. Archaeology suggests that selecting stable ground mattered enormously because a monument this heavy does not forgive a careless foundation. The evidence we do have points to intentional site planning, including leveling and arranging the plateau to support massive structures. You can't just eyeball a pyramid and hope for the best. Well, you can, but then you end up with a tragic sandcastle and a bruised ego. You step over a shallow rise where the limestone is exposed, and you imagine the plateau as it might have looked before the first royal order came down the line. The wind still moves the same, and the horizon still stretches wide, but the surface is different, rougher, more uneven, maybe dotted with low stone outcrops with scattered debris from older activity that wouldn't scream monument to a modern visitor. And this is where the question from tonight's outline settles into your palm, like that pebble from earlier. What happened on this ground before the famous stone mountains appeared? Archaeology suggests that ancient builders often incorporated bedrock into their plans. It's broadly accepted that the Great Pyramid's core includes a natural outcrop of limestone, meaning the builders didn't only build upward, they built around what was already there. The evidence we do have points to a practical mindset. If the Earth offers a stable mass, you use it. You don't argue with geology because geology does not negotiate. It will simply wait a few centuries and win. One interpretation is that this habit of building with the landscape, not against it, might hint at earlier site knowledge, not necessarily a secret civilization with laser levels and glossy brochures, but prior activity that taught people how the plateau behaves. It's possible that early dynastic crews, or even pre-dynastic communities, use this ridge for smaller structures, ritual markers, quarry tests, or work camps. Those traces, if they existed, could have been erased or covered as the Fourth Dynasty project reshaped the surface. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in the case of specific pre-pyramid installations on the plateau, the evidence can be fragmentary and hard to separate from later disturbances. But the idea doesn't need strong drama to be interesting. It's enough to picture a long learning curve, a few generations measuring where the rock is strongest, where water access is easiest, where ramps could climb without collapsing, where the sun hits in ways that help you sight a straight line. The plateau becomes not just a location, but a practiced workspace. Historians still argue whether the plateau's preparation was mostly done as part of the Fourth Dynasty's building campaign or whether there were earlier phases of organized work that shaped key areas before the Grand Pyramids rose. And you can feel how that argument stays safely in the realm of reasonable questions. Even if you never discover a tidy answer, the debate itself helps you see Giza as a process rather than a single moment. The pyramids might be the final performance, but the plateau is the stage that had to be built first. What's broadly accepted is that building a pyramid required massive movement of materials, limestone, from nearby quarries, finer casing stones from farther away, granite from the south for certain interior spaces. Archaeology suggests transport involved sledges, lubricated tracks, manpower, and carefully timed logistics tied to seasonal cycles. None of that works unless the ground is prepared to handle traffic. That means pathways, work zones, places to store tools and stone, places to eat, sleep, and argue about whose turn it is to haul the rope. And yes, you can absolutely picture an ancient worker saying with the tired confidence of a modern office employee, "I'm just here for the beer ration." A careful reading might suggest that the biggest before question is not about who built the pyramids, but about how much of the infrastructure had to exist in advance. It's possible that some routes were established first long before the main blocks started moving, because you don't wait until the day of the big move to discover your road is basically a sand trap with ambitions. A more cautious explanation could be that many preparatory steps were part of the same overall project, just earlier phases that leave fewer obvious traces. The evidence we do have points to enormous planning, but planning is not always archaeologically loud. Still, your mind wanders because the desert encourages that kind of wandering. A fringe idea proposes that Giza sits atop older foundations from a civilization before dynastic Egypt, and that later Egyptians simply inherited the site. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the strongest evidence does not currently require it. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can use it in the gentlest way as a prompt to ask, what kinds of earlier activity could be real without turning into fantasy? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's one thing to wonder whether older communities used this plateau. It's another thing to declare a fully formed lost civilization without solid archaeological support. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You keep walking, and you start seeing the plateau as a kind of recycled blueprint. Not because someone dug up an ancient scroll labeled "How to Build Giza," but because landscapes carry memory. Once a route works, it gets used again. Once a work area is cleared, it stays useful. Once a slope proves stable, someone returns to it with a new project and says, "We're doing that again, but bigger." Human beings love that move. It's called best practices, and it has probably been annoying for thousands of years. You pause, looking out toward where the Nile would be, imagining its ancient channels, the boats, the timing of floods, the way a seasonal rhythm could shape construction schedules. Archaeology suggests the Nile was central to transport and life, and that matters for the plateau too. The site is close enough to the river to be supplied, but high enough to stay above floodwaters. The evidence we do have points to strategic thinking. Not mystical, strategic. And yet you let yourself drift into a calm what if, because that's part of the bedtime magic. What if the plateau is older than the story we tell about it? Not in the sense of aliens did it, but in the sense of people were already here, already working, already learning. What if earlier hands tested this stone, built small things, left faint traces, then vanished into time, because mud brick doesn't last like limestone? What if the grand Fourth Dynasty plan is the moment the plateau's long apprenticeship finally goes public? You hear the imagined scrape of a stone sledge, the soft grunt of ropes tightening, and somewhere in your mind, a supervisor clears his throat with the same energy as a modern manager opening a meeting. All right, team, quick sync, before we move 2 million blocks. Your shoulders drop again because sleep-friendly history is partly about realizing that ancient people were people, and people are consistent in the funniest ways. The plateau stretches ahead, quiet, solid, and stubborn. It holds up the pyramids, and it holds up the questions too. You keep that pebble in your hand for a moment longer, then let it fall gently back to the ground, like returning a small piece of certainty to the place that made it. And you walk on, not claiming a hidden truth, just following the terrain, listening for what it might suggest. You drift onward in that slow, sleepy pace, and the plateau starts to feel less like a single monument site and more like a whole landscape stitched together by choices. Your eyes keep getting pulled toward the darker shape, ahead low and long against the sand, as if the desert is trying to hide something in plain sight by making it look ordinary. And then you realize you're staring at the Sphinx area in your mind's eye, that place where stone becomes a creature and a question at the same time. Most historians agree that the Great Sphinx of Giza is part of the Fourth Dynasty landscape, often associated with Pharaoh Khafre's complex and archaeology, suggests the carving fits within the broader building program of that era. That's the documented anchor, and it's sturdy. The evidence we do have points to a monumental sculpture carved from the limestone bedrock itself, meaning it's not something that was hauled here. It's something the plateau surrendered. You walk closer in imagination, and the air feels different, like the stone has its own temperature. The Sphinx always seems to be half asleep, which makes it a perfect bedtime companion, honestly. It's reclining like it knows you're tired, like it's been waiting for you to stop scrolling and finally come listen. The face looks calm, the body looks worn, and the whole thing feels like a sentence missing its last word. And this is where your mind wants to jump. It wants to do that thing humans do where we see erosion and we immediately write a dramatic backstory. But we're going to keep our pace slow and our language careful. Historians still argue whether certain weathering patterns on the Sphinx and its enclosure are best explained by wind and sand, over long periods by water exposure in some form, or by a combination of factors, including later quarrying repairs, and the specific qualities of different limestone layers. That single sentence is a whole universe of debate, and it's one of the best examples of how the mystery can exist without turning into certainty. What's broadly accepted is that the Sphinx has been repaired repeatedly in antiquity and later, and that it has suffered erosion from natural forces. Archaeology suggests that the limestone layers vary in hardness, so some parts erode faster than others, creating grooves and shapes that can look dramatic. A more cautious explanation could be that different rock layers plus thousands of years of exposure can produce patterns that appear designed when they're really the stone's own personality showing through. Now, one interpretation is that some aspects of the weathering invite questions about timing and environment. This is where certain alternative theories like to step in, wearing a confident smile. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx could be much older than the Fourth Dynasty, possibly dating back to a time with heavier rainfall in the region, and that later dynastic Egyptians recarved or reused it. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is debated and not conclusive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a prompt. What kinds of evidence would we need to confidently push the date earlier? And do we have that evidence? If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for an extremely early Sphinx far outside the mainstream timeline, the evidence remains contested. The strongest mainstream view still places it in the Old Kingdom context, tied to the surrounding architectural and cultural setting. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, like the exact sequence of carving enclosure shaping and later modifications. You let your imagination lean in gently anyway, because bedtime is the right time for soft what-if moments. What if the plateau had an earlier sacred outline, an older carved feature, a natural formation that was revered, and the 4th dynasty builders decided to refine it into a royal symbol? Not because they were covering up a secret, but because ancient societies frequently reuse meaningful places. Even in your world, you build new buildings on old city centers, put new paint on old walls, and call it renovation, like it's a modern invention. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The idea of reuse is mainstream friendly. Archaeology suggests many ancient sites show layers of building and rebuilding. But tying that to a dramatically older Sphinx is still debated. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You circle the imagined enclosure, and you think about the way the Sphinx is carved from bedrock. That fact alone is powerful. It means the builders didn't only bring stone here, they also transformed the plateau itself into art. The evidence we do have points to a landscape that was sculpted, not just occupied. One mainstream safe anchor is that the 4th dynasty created a highly integrated, complex, pyramids, causeways, valley temples, and associated structures arranged with intention. Archaeology suggests the causeways connected mortuary temples to the Nile-side valley temples, forming a ceremonial route. The plateau was planned like a sacred campus, and you can feel the geometry of belief in it. One interpretation is that when a society builds with that level of integration, it might be tapping into older traditions of sacred geography. It's possible that certain alignments or placements were chosen because the site already held meaning even before the biggest royal projects. And what if the before Egypt feeling isn't about a separate civilization, but about a deeper well of ritual practice, local memory, and inherited landscape knowledge? Now, because your brain likes to snack on oddities, here's a quirky tidbit framed safely. A popular rumor claims there are hidden chambers under the Sphinx that contain lost records or a secret library. This rumor is persistent, and it's great for late-night conversations, but it's not something we can treat as established fact. The evidence for dramatic libraries under the Sphinx is thin and often tied to modern myth-making. Still, the idea survives because the Sphinx looks like it knows something. It's hard not to feel that way when a stone creature stares past you, past your era, into a horizon you can't see. To be clear, this is debated. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You take one more slow look at that sleeping face. In your mind, the wind drifts over it like a blanket. The stones around it hold the warmth of the day and release it slowly into the night. And you realize the Sphinx is not just an artifact. It's an invitation to think about time in layers: the time of carving, the time of repair, the time of erosion, the time of stories that grow around a monument until the stories become their own kind of architecture. The plateau doesn't give you a clean answer. It gives you a posture, a way of looking. It says, stand here long enough and you'll see how human history is, both solid and misty at once. The solid is the stone, the labor, the dynasties, the tools. The mist is the questions that linger, because the documentation is incomplete, because the desert preserves some things, and erases others because people tell stories when they don't like silence. And as you turn away from the Sphinx area, you carry that feeling forward that the face you just imagined might be a later mask, or it might simply be an old kingdom masterpiece that has been weathered into mystery. Either way, the result is the same for tonight's walk. You keep going, not chasing a hidden truth, but letting the puzzle stay a puzzle, letting the night stay soft. You keep gliding forward, and the plateau starts feeling less like a collection of stones and more like a giant measuring instrument that just happens to be shaped like a mountain. The air is still, and above you the sky looks sharp, as if someone wiped it clean with a dry cloth. If you let your eyes soften, you can imagine the ancient night doing what it has always done here, offering a ceiling full of reference points. Most historians agree that ancient Egyptians watched the sky closely for practical reasons, as well as spiritual ones. Archaeology suggests that star observations helped with calendars, seasonal timing, and ritual symbolism, and the evidence we do have points to careful surveying traditions that could produce remarkably straight lines and near-true orientations. When you stand on open ground like this with a wide horizon and no city glow, you understand why the sky becomes a tool. It's the only thing that is always up there, always repeating, always dependable in a world where your rope can fray and your sandals can betray you. You pause and look along an imagined edge line of the Great Pyramid. Even in your mind, it feels like the structure is pointing, like it has an opinion about direction. What's broadly accepted is that the Great Pyramid is oriented very close to true north, close enough to make modern people blink twice, and then mutter, "Okay, that's annoying. It's not magic, it's measurement." Still, it's the kind of measurement that makes you respect a society that could align stone with the world as it actually is. Archaeology suggests that one way to find north is to use the stars, particularly circumpolar stars that move around the sky without setting. Another mainstream safe anchor is that the sun can be used too through shadow tracking and repeated observations, because shadows are basically nature's free drawing tool. The evidence we do have points to multiple plausible methods. The main point is that they had procedures, and procedures can be taught, repeated, and improved. Historians still argue whether the builders relied primarily on specific star pairs, broader circumpolar observations, or solar shadow techniques to establish true north with that level of precision. That debate is a gentle reminder that we're often reconstructing technique from outcomes. You see the result and you have to work backward. It's like finding a perfectly frosted cake and trying to determine whether the baker used a spatula, a piping bag, or pure spite. The cake exists. The frosting is real. The method is the part that keeps slipping into the mist. One interpretation is that the precision suggests not just good eyesight, but institutional experience. A careful reading might suggest that surveyors were trained specialists, people who did this work repeatedly, possibly building on older practices that existed before the Grand Fourth Dynasty projects. It's possible that generations of smaller constructions, temples, tombs, and administrative buildings created a culture where alignment was normal, expected, and checked obsessively. If you've ever worked with someone who measures twice, cuts once, then measures again because they don't trust the concept of once you've met the spirit of this. And then because the night encourages imagination, you let a calm, what if drift in. What if the sky is not only a guide, but a memory? What if the builders are not just aligning stone to the north, but aligning their civilization to a story they tell about order, eternity, and returning cycles? The sky becomes a pattern, and a pattern becomes a ritual, and a ritual becomes architecture, Of course, your brain also wants to do that thing where it takes a pattern and turns it into a secret. This is where the fringe shelf comes in neatly labeled so you can browse it without accidentally treating it like a textbook. A fringe idea proposes that the layout of the three main pyramids mirrors a pattern of stars often discussed in popular culture as a kind of cosmic map. This theory isn't widely accepted, and many scholars argue the alignments can be explained through practical planning, topography, and the needs of the mortuary complexes. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still be useful in a bedtime way. It reminds you that people love connecting earth and sky, and that symbolism may have mattered, even when practicality did most of the heavy lifting. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence for a precise, intentional, one-to-one star map is not conclusive. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, especially when later observers overlay modern expectations onto ancient choices. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The ancient Egyptians absolutely cared about the sky, and star symbolism appears in their religious ideas. But turning that into a single master blueprint for Giza can be a stretch, and stretches are best done slowly, like you're warming up before a jog you will probably abandon after 3 minutes. You walk again, and the sound you imagine is soft sand underfoot, wind brushing stone, and that gentle fan hum you might have in your room, blending with the idea of night air moving across the plateau. You picture a surveyor standing with a simple toolkit, rope, stakes, a straight edge, a plumb line hanging from a stick, steadying itself the way your thoughts are steadying now. Archaeology suggests that ropes in simple geometry can produce right angles and straight lines with impressive reliability. The evidence we do have points to techniques that don't require modern machines, only patience and repetition. One mainstream safe anchor is that large-scale projects in the Old Kingdom were supported by administrative systems that could feed workers and coordinate labor. Precision isn't only math. Precision is also scheduling oversight, and someone whose entire job is to say, no, do it again without getting punched in the spirit. One interpretation is that this kind of surveying tradition may have roots that go deeper than the moment the first huge blocks moved. It's possible that early communities along the Nile built up practical astronomy and measurement in small steps, then scaled it up when the state became powerful enough to concentrate resources at Giza. That fits the continuity picture before Egypt, as before the biggest monuments, before the grand paperwork, before the era that leaves stone everywhere. Now the cinematic what if comes softly, like a blanket you barely notice settling. What if on some earlier night, on some earlier version of this plateau, people stood here with fewer resources, fewer stones, fewer written records, and still watched the same stars? What if they practiced finding north for reasons we can't fully reconstruct? Navigation ritual, timing, tradition. What if those habits survived into the Old Kingdom, not as a secret, but as a craft? You tilt your head and stare at the sky long enough that it starts to look like a ceiling painted by someone with too much patience. And you realize something that's both comforting and slightly funny. If you rely on stars, you also rely on the weather. One cloudy week, and your entire schedule becomes ancient Egypt, now featuring delays. You can almost hear a foreman sighing, "Sorry, Pharaoh, the universe did not cooperate today." A popular rumor claims that the pyramid builders had knowledge so advanced it must have come from elsewhere, from outsiders, from lost civilizations, from anything that lets you skip the boring part where humans learn slowly. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have still points more strongly to local development, skilled labor, and cumulative expertise. But the rumor persists because it flatters our love of spectacle. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it helps you see how often mystery grows when documentation is incomplete. And documentation is incomplete. That's the honest, sleepy truth. The stones remain, the outlines remain, the results remain. The exact steps, the nightly observations, the arguments over technique, the little mistakes corrected quietly before dawn, those are the parts the desert doesn't always keep. So you let the sky be both a tool and a poem. You let the pyramid be both a monument and a measurement. You don't force a single hidden truth. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And you continue walking calm and steady, as if the stars themselves are guiding your pace, one slow breath at a time. You keep walking with the pyramids to your side, and at some point you realize your brain has started doing math without asking your permission. It's rude, honestly. You came here to be calm, to let the desert breeze and that soft fan hum in your room lull you into sleep. And suddenly your mind is counting slopes, corners, and distances like it's trying to solve a puzzle for extra credit. Most historians agree that the builders worked with standardized units, especially the cubit, and archaeology suggests there were measuring rods and consistent planning practices that helped keep construction coherent across years. The evidence we do have points to a society that could measure, record, and repeat design choices in a controlled way. That's the solid ground. It's not mystical. It's administration and craft, the ancient version of someone saying, we're using the same template, please don't freestyle the geometry. You stand there and imagine the builders laying out the base, not with floating holograms or a glowing blueprint in the sky, but with rope stakes and careful checks. What's broadly accepted is that the Great Pyramid's proportions and slopes were chosen deliberately. Archaeology suggests ancient Egyptian builders understood practical geometry, and they used a way of describing slope that's often discussed as the sikid, basically a ratio describing how much the pyramid rises for a certain horizontal run. It's a very human approach, like describing a hill by saying, for every step forward, you go up this much. You can almost hear a tired worker asking, how steep is it? And the engineer replying, steep enough that you'll complain either way. Now comes the part where Pattern Hunger enters the chat wearing a trench coat, carrying a calculator, and pretending it's here on official business. One interpretation is that some proportions might reflect symbolic preferences, like favoring certain slopes for aesthetic or religious reasons, not just structural ones. A careful reading might suggest that consistency across monuments can arise from a tradition of rules that apprentices learn and repeat. It's possible that these rules were inherited, refined from earlier building projects and carried forward like a quiet craft secret that isn't dramatic enough to become a legend. But you and I both know legends don't form around consistent ratios and reliable units, even though that's actually impressive. Historians still argue whether specific numerical relationships people find in the Great Pyramid reflect intentional ancient design choices or modern pattern finding applied after the fact. That debate matters because it keeps you from slipping into the trap where every interesting number becomes a coded message. And the pyramids are perfect bait for that trap because they're geometric, iconic, and old enough to feel like they've had time to gather secrets the way a sweater gathers lint. Archaeology suggests the builders were highly competent, and the evidence we do have points to deliberate proportions that worked structurally and symbolically. But when modern people start talking about the pyramid containing pi or phi or a secret map of the earth, it's worth slowing down. Not to mock it, but to sort it gently. A popular rumor claims that the Great Pyramid encodes the value of pi in its perimeter and height relationship, as if the builders were winking at modern mathematics. This rumor is not universally accepted as intentional design, and it's often debated because you can derive many ratios from a large structure, and find something familiar if you look long enough. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a calmer framing emerges even without encoding modern constants. The builders could still arrive at practical ratios that happen to resemble values we recognize today. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A coincidence can still be meaningful in a human way because it tells you what ratios are useful, stable, and pleasing to the eye. But coincidence is not the same as a deliberate message. The truth ladder stays helpful here. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented is the use of units and planning methods, and the likely use of slope rules that produce consistent forms. Interpretation is the idea that certain proportions were chosen for symbolic reasons we can only partially reconstruct. Imagined is the cozy. What if that the builders smiled knowingly while placing blocks, thinking, this will confuse someone in 4,500 years? It's fun, but it's mist, and we'll keep it labeled as mist. You walk closer to one of the pyramid faces and let your gaze travel upward, following the angle until it disappears into night. The slope feels deliberate, like it belongs to a rule. The evidence we do have points to intentional engineering. A more cautious explanation could be that many mysterious ratios are simply the byproduct of building a stable, tall pyramid with available materials and labor constraints. When you build at scale, certain solutions become attractive again and again. It's like how every office eventually reinvents the same kind of spreadsheet, and everyone acts surprised. Now your mind drifts to another layer of number lore. People love to measure the pyramids in modern units like inches, and then treat the results like the builders were secretly using those units too. A fringe idea proposes that pyramid inches represent a special ancient standard connected to global measurements. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence we do have more strongly supports Egyptian units like the cubit, with local standards and practical measuring tools. Still, the fringe idea persists because it feels like a bridge between ancient stone and modern certainty, a way to make the past talk in today's language. And you can see how easy it is to slip. Your brain wants to turn the pyramid into a calculator. But the pyramid was not built for your math hobby, even if it accidentally supports it. It was built for the needs of its time: royal power, religious belief, monumental display, and a society capable of coordinating huge workforces. One mainstream safe anchor is that Old Kingdom Egypt had a strong administrative system that could mobilize labor-managed food supplies and oversee long-term projects. Archaeology suggests the workers were supported by infrastructure that kept them fed and organized. And that matters for numbers because measurement is not just knowledge, it's discipline. It's the ability to make the same measurement tomorrow and next month and 5 years from now and still trust it. One interpretation is that the rule behind Giza might be less about hidden math and more about cultural standardization. The state deciding what counts as correct, what counts as sacred, what counts as beautiful. It's possible that earlier generations developed these norms gradually through smaller projects and repeated practice. This is where before Egypt can be understood in a grounded way, not as a separate lost civilization, but as a long runway of learning before the Old Kingdom took off dramatically. But because bedtime history should also give you one quirky snack, here's a gentle one. There are people who claim the pyramid's measurements predict everything from the speed of light to future dates, as if the monument is an ancient prophecy machine. That's firmly in the category of popular myth-making, and it isn't something we can treat as established. Still, it reveals something real about humans. When faced with something enormous and old, we try to make it talk. And sometimes we make it talk too much. To be clear, this is debated. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. If you want a calmer way to hold the wonder, hold it in the craft. Hold it in the fact that a society without modern engines could coordinate stone time and people into a shape that still stands. You let your breathing slow as you imagine a surveyor checking a line again, then again, then again, because perfection is a direction, not a destination. You picture the plumb line from earlier hanging motionless in the still air, the simplest truth teller in the toolkit. And you picture the workers quietly irritated, quietly proud, repeating the same rule until the rule becomes stone. And then you let the numbers fade a little like chalk dust in the wind. Not because they're unimportant, but because sleep is arriving and sleep does not care about your ratios. Sleep just wants the story to keep gliding forward, one calm step at a time. You keep drifting along the edge of the plateau, and the conversation in your head shifts from angles and stars to something more grounded, more physical. Stone, weight, distance. The kind of reality that makes your shoulders tense, just thinking about it, even while you're lying safely in bed, with absolutely no limestone blocks on your to-do list. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid and its neighbors were built primarily with limestone from nearby quarries, and archaeology suggests that different grades of stone were chosen for different jobs. The evidence we do have points to a practical sorting system: common local limestone for the bulk finer casing stone from farther away, and granite from the south for certain interior elements. That's the solid ground, and it's already impressive. It means the pyramids are not just monuments, they're supply chains carved into the landscape. You imagine walking down from the plateau toward where the Nile channels once ran closer, back when the river's behavior shaped everything. You can almost smell wet reeds and mud, even though tonight's air is dry. The Nile is not a background detail. It's the highway. It's the conveyor belt. It's the reason heavy stone can move in quantities that would otherwise be absurd. Archaeology suggests that boats transported stone along the river, and the evidence we do have points to harbors, landing zones, and logistical planning tied to seasons. When the Nile rises, it changes what's reachable. When it falls, it changes what's stuck. Most historians agree that timing mattered, because you can't run a massive building project on pure enthusiasm. You need predictable rhythms. Food supply, water access, transport routes, and yes, you need the kind of planning that makes modern project managers whisper respect. You picture the quarry first. Not romantic, not cinematic, just hard work day after day. The sun hits the rock, heat rises, dust sticks to sweat, and the sound is relentless, pounding, scraping, tapping the little metallic click of a copper chisel meeting stone. Archaeology suggests copper tools were used along with harder stone pounders, and the evidence we do have points to repeated methodical labor rather than a single flashy technique. One interpretation is that the real magic is standardization. If your blocks are roughly consistent, your transport is smoother, your sledges fit, your ramps behave, your teams get faster. A careful reading might suggest that a mature quarrying tradition must exist before you attempt a project on this scale. It's possible that earlier generations, long before the Giza skyline became the skyline, practiced quarrying and stoneworking in less dramatic contexts, building tombs, temples, and foundations that train skills quietly. And then, because the desert is good at inviting what if, thoughts you let one drift in gently. What if the quarry itself holds a memory of older work, older cuts, older experiments that were later expanded and regularized. Not a secret civilization with impossible machines, but an older habit of shaping stone that grows more confident over time. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Now your mind follows the stone as it leaves the quarry, and this is where you start hearing the story as a soundscape. Ropes tightening, wood creaking, men calling a rhythm, sledges scraping over a prepared surface. If you listen closely, the sound almost matches your own breathing, slow and steady. Sleep-friendly logistics, which is not a phrase anyone expected to say, but here we are. Most historians agree that blocks were hauled on sledges, and archaeology suggests that wetting the sand can reduce friction. The evidence we do have points to practical physics, the kind that doesn't require secret knowledge, only observation and trial. You can picture a worker splashing water ahead of the runners, not because he's performing a ritual, but because someone noticed it worked, and then everyone copied it forever. That is how technology spreads in real life, not with trumpet fanfares, but with tired people saying, "Do that thing again, it makes this less terrible." Historians still argue whether the most important transport innovations at Giza were the boats on the Nile, the prepared roads and ramps near the plateau, or the organization of labor teams that made every step repeatable. That debate is comforting in a weird way because it keeps the story human. It reminds you that the how is not always a single invention. Sometimes the how is a whole ecosystem of solutions, each one good enough, all of them stacked together like blocks. You imagine the river journey. A barge sits low in the water under the weight of stone. The current moves it northward. The sun flashes on the surface, and the stone stays silent, like it already knows where it's going. It's possible that certain routes were used repeatedly with landing points and canals adjusted over time. Archaeology suggests there were harbor facilities near Giza, and the evidence we do have points to water management as part of the larger operation. One mainstream safe anchor is simply this moving, heavy material in the ancient world usually meant using water whenever possible. And Egypt has the waterway that matters. One interpretation is that the Nile's reliability made ambitious architecture more feasible. A careful reading might suggest that Giza is less a miracle of stone and more a miracle of planning around a river. Then your mind climbs back up from the river to the plateau where everything gets harder again. The last stretch is the cruel part. Boats help sure, but at some point you have to drag stone uphill across ground that wants to shift under your feet. You can almost feel the rope burn in your palms, and you're not even holding anything. Your body reacts anyway because your brain is polite like that. Archaeology suggests that roads were prepared surfaces leveled and ramps used in some form, even if the exact shapes and configurations remain debated. The evidence we do have points to multiple possible approaches: straight ramps, side ramps, zigzag ramps, maybe combinations. It's possible that methods changed depending on the stage of construction and the type of block being moved. A more cautious explanation could be that builders used whatever worked, adjusted constantly, and didn't care at all that future people would argue on the internet about it. Now for your quirky tidbit carefully framed. A popular rumor claims that the stones were softened or cast like concrete poured into place rather than hauled. This idea shows up often in alternative discussions, but it isn't widely accepted as the main explanation, and the evidence most scholars emphasize still supports quarrying and stone cutting for the vast majority of blocks. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes another question: where do we see clear signs of natural stone versus material that would look mixed or molded? If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it remains thin in the way the rumor usually wants it to be thick. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The mainstream picture is already complex and impressive without needing an exotic process. Quarrying transport ramps and labor organization can explain a lot, even if details remain uncertain. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, like the exact day-to-day choices that made the whole machine run smoothly. And if you allow yourself one more calm, what if you can keep it grounded? What if some of the logistics were inherited? What if earlier building traditions developed systems of hauling rope work and stone management that were later scaled up at Giza? Not a separate civilization hiding in the shadows, but a deeper tradition of craft that doesn't leave dramatic monuments until the state grows powerful enough to concentrate resources here. You feel your thoughts slow again, like the barge drifting with the current. Stone becomes less a riddle and more a rhythm. Cut, haul, float, drag, set, repeat. And the repetition is almost hypnotic. The blocks keep arriving. The teams keep pulling. The desert keeps watching. You keep walking calm and steady, letting the pyramid's true wonder settle into the simplest truth of all. A lot of people over a lot of days moved a lot of stone, and somehow that is the kind of fact that makes you sleepy, not because it's boring, but because it's steady, because it's real, because it doesn't need a secret to be astonishing. You keep that slow, drifting pace, and now the pyramids stop feeling like outer shapes and start feeling like locked rooms. Not locked in a dramatic movie heist way, but locked in the quiet way a closed door changes a hallway. From the outside, you see smooth planes and hard edges. From the inside, you're dealing with passages, angles, dead ends, and choices that someone made with a lamp in their hand and dust in their throat. Most historians agree that the interior of the Great Pyramid includes a set of planned spaces and corridors that reflect both function and belief. And archaeology suggests that the design likely evolved during construction rather than being a single, unchanging blueprint from day one. The evidence we do have points to a complex internal layout, descending and ascending passages, chambers at different levels, and the long sloping corridor often called the Grand Gallery. This is the solid ground the builders didn't just stack stone, they engineered interior systems that had to remain stable under unimaginable weight. You imagine stepping into the entrance and the temperature drops in your mind. The air becomes still, the sound of the desert fades, and your footsteps feel louder because stone indoors always makes you feel like you're being judged. You move through tight corridors where the ceiling seems to hover inches above your head, even if you're not particularly tall. And you notice how quickly the pyramid stops feeling mystical and starts feeling practical. Every corridor is a compromise between access and security. Every chamber is a compromise between symbolism and structure. Every turn is a place where you can hear the builders thinking. Archaeology suggests that some internal features were intended to deter looting or control access, and what's broadly accepted is that pyramids were targets for thieves across centuries. That doesn't make the builders paranoid, it makes them realistic. You can almost hear an ancient planner saying, "We're building the most famous tomb in the country, so yes, someone will try something." And you in your modern bed nod, as if you've ever protected anything more valuable than your phone charger. One interpretation is that the Great Pyramid's shifting interior plan hints at on-the-ground decision-making, possibly responding to structural concerns or changing ideas about how the monument should function. A careful reading might suggest that this kind of adaptability points to a mature engineering culture, the kind that can change course midstream without collapsing the whole project. That's not a sign of confusion. That's a sign of competence. And then you arrive at the part that pulls you gently into the mist. The spaces we don't fully understand, the cavities and voids that don't come with clear labels. The pyramid is famous for what we can walk through, but it's also famous for what we can't. Historians still argue whether certain internal voids and unexplored spaces in the Great Pyramid were intentional design features, structural relief spaces, construction remnants, or parts of a plan that changed while the monument was still rising. That sentence carries a whole bedtime-friendly thrill because it tells you there's room for wonder without forcing a conclusion. It's possible that some empty spaces are simply the byproduct of building techniques, like gaps left by ramps or by construction staging areas that were later sealed. A more cautious explanation could be that voids can exist for structural reasons, to reduce stress, redistribute weight, or prevent cracking in key areas. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for many specific voids, the evidence can be suggestive rather than conclusive. Now, on the documented side, archaeology suggests that modern non-invasive techniques have revealed unexpected features inside the Great Pyramid, including a large void detected in the upper areas. The evidence we do have points to at least one significant hidden space that isn't part of the traditionally accessible corridors. That's real, and it's fascinating, and it doesn't automatically mean secret chamber of destiny. It means there's a space we haven't fully mapped or explained. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Finding a void is not the same as finding a lost archive, a hidden treasure room, or a dramatic message from the past. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the most cautious interpretation often comes first. Voids might be structural or related to construction phases. Still, your imagination gets to breathe a little. You picture the pyramid as a body and the void as a lung, a hollow that helps the whole thing endure. What if some spaces are purposeful in a way that isn't ceremonial, but practical, like leaving a hidden pocket so stone above doesn't press too hard? And what if in a different scenario a void is a deliberate known unknown, an empty room created for a ritual function we no longer understand, left sealed because the act of sealing was part of the meaning? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You move in your mind through the grand gallery, that long, high corridor with its precise angles, and you can feel how it might have served multiple roles: a passage, a staging zone, a place to manage heavy internal components. Archaeology suggests the Great Pyramid's internal design required careful coordination, and what's broadly accepted is that it represents a high point of Old Kingdom monument engineering. One mainstream safe anchor is simply that building interior chambers inside a massive stone structure requires anticipating load paths, pressure, and stability long before you place the final blocks. Your sleepy brain tries to picture weight distribution, and it immediately regrets it. The pyramid is quietly pressing down with millions of tons, and you're over here thinking, wow, my neck pillow is really doing a lot. That's joke one, and it's also a reminder that engineering is just the art of making heavy things behave. One interpretation is that the builders used a combination of learned tradition and real-time problem solving. It's possible that earlier pyramid projects taught them what worked and what failed, and that the Great Pyramid represents not a sudden leap from nothing but a refinement of lessons learned. If you want a grounded version of a civilization before Egypt, this is where it lives, not a separate forgotten empire, but a deeper runway of trial error and craft knowledge before the most famous build. Now let your mind drift toward the smaller mysteries, the details that feel like whispers. Air shafts, for example, which have been discussed and debated for decades. What's broadly accepted is that some narrow channels extend from certain chambers toward the exterior, and archaeology suggests they may relate to ventilation construction needs or symbolic pathways tied to religious ideas about the soul and the sky. A careful reading might suggest they could serve more than one function, because ancient builders were perfectly capable of making one feature do two jobs, especially when cutting through stone is not exactly a casual pastime. And here comes joke 2. If you ever complain about your apartment having bad airflow, just remember you're not trying to ventilate a stone mountain with a narrow shaft while holding an oil lamp and hoping your boss doesn't notice you're panicking. Perspective is a calming thing. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramid's hidden spaces form a deliberate network, like a coded interior map, and that the true purpose of the monument is still concealed. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it sticks around because it's emotionally satisfying. It makes the pyramid feel like a puzzle box built by geniuses who were also apparently part-time escape room designers. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a softer question. Could there be areas we haven't accessed that would clarify the builder's intentions? Or are the unknown spaces simply the leftovers of how the building was assembled? If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for sweeping claims about a hidden interior system with a secret function, the evidence tends to be thin. The evidence we do have points more strongly to construction logic, structural necessities, and evolving plans with symbolism woven through the choices rather than replacing them. You keep moving, and the pyramid in your mind becomes quieter, less like a riddle shouting for attention, and more like a library with missing pages. You can read enough to understand the plot, but some chapters are torn out. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Joke 3 arrives gently because your brain insists modern people love to say, why don't they just open it up and look as if you can casually renovate a world-famous monument like you're checking the attic for old holiday decorations? You can picture an archaeologist sighing the way a tired parent sighs and saying, yes, honey, we'll just move several million tons of stone aside very carefully and then put it back, no big deal. So you stay with what's responsible. You stay with non-invasive discovery where possible. You stay with cautious language. You accept that some spaces remain unknown, not because someone is hiding the truth, but because preservation matters and certainty is hard. And yet you allow one last calm what if, because bedtime history is allowed to be tender with questions. What if one of those voids someday clarifies a choice we've misunderstood? Not a treasure, not a prophecy, just a practical explanation or a symbolic detail that makes the design feel suddenly more human. What if the unknown space is simply the builder's quiet signature, a reminder that even the most controlled project leaves behind places where the plan and the reality didn't match perfectly? You breathe out slowly. The pyramid remains heavy and patient. Its corridors hold what we can map. Its voids hold what we can't. You don't force the mist into stone. You let the puzzle remain a puzzle. And you keep walking forward through the night, steady as a survey line, calm as a plumb line, finally coming to rest. You leave the cool imagined corridors behind and step back into open night, and it feels like you've walked out of a sealed jar into fresh air. The pyramid is still there, still enormous, but now the focus shifts away from hidden chambers and toward the living machinery that made all of it possible. Not gears and pistons, not glowing panels, just people, teams, schedules, bread, beer, The kind of things history rarely puts on a pedestal, even though they hold up everything else. Most historians agree that the Giza pyramids were built by organized labor forces, including skilled workers, and rotating crews, and archaeology suggests that worker communities existed nearby with evidence of food production, administrative oversight, and medical care. The evidence we do have points to a functioning society capable of supporting thousands of workers over long periods. That's the mainstream anchor, and it's honestly one of the most astonishing parts of the whole story. You imagine approaching the workers' settlement not as a tourist site, but as a living place. Smoke curls from cooking fires. Someone is grinding grain. Someone is yelling because the bread is burning. And someone else is yelling back because that's the only volume they know. There are storage areas, workshops, and the constant movement of people who have places to be. The air smells like ash, warm dough sweat, and dust. It's oddly comforting because it makes the pyramids feel less like alien artifacts and more like the result of a real community with real routines. Archaeology suggests that workers received rations, including bread and beer, and that animals were slaughtered to feed large crews, indicating substantial provisioning. The evidence we do have points to planning that goes beyond a single monument and into the realm of governance. You can't keep thousands of people working if you can't keep them fed, and you can't keep them fed unless you have supply lines, administrators, and record keepers who spend their days counting sacks of grain and pretending they're fine. One interpretation is that the pyramids are not just proof of engineering skill, but proof of social organization. A careful reading might suggest that the civilization behind Giza is not only defined by its stonework, but by its ability to coordinate labor, distribute resources, enforce schedules, and maintain morale. It's possible that this level of organization didn't appear out of nowhere in the Fourth Dynasty, but grew over generations as the Nile Valley communities became more unified and administratively sophisticated. And here's your bedtime-friendly what-if, gentle and cinematic without turning into a conclusion. What if the true builders of Giza are less a mysterious group and more a long chain of communities, learning how to organize themselves, slowly developing systems that culminate in these huge projects? What if before Egypt is really before the version of Egypt that leaves the biggest stone receipts? Historians still argue whether the workforce at Giza was primarily composed of seasonal laborers rotating in from across Egypt, a more permanent specialized labor population living near the site, or some combination of both. That debate matters because it shapes how you imagine the project. If crews rotated seasonally, then Giza becomes a national effort tied to agricultural cycles, with workers arriving when farming demands are lower. If a more permanent group lived here, then you have a specialized community of builders whose skills deepen over time. The evidence we do have points to organization and specialization, but the exact balance is still discussed. You picture a supervisor walking through rows of workers, not with a whip, but with a list. A list is always scarier than a whip because a whip ends, but a list never ends. He checks names, he checks rations, he checks who's missing. And if someone tries to fake an illness, you can imagine him giving the ancient equivalent of a skeptical eyebrow and saying, "Sure, sure. Your back hurts. It's almost like you've been dragging stone all day." Archaeology suggests there were skilled craftspeople involved: stone cutters, carpenters, rope makers, tool makers, and the survey specialists who kept everything aligned. The evidence we do have points to division of labor training and a culture where certain skills mattered enough to be supported and protected. This is mainstream, and it's also quietly thrilling because it means the pyramids are a visible monument to invisible expertise. One interpretation is that the workers' city represents a kind of early industrial organization, scaled to the resources of its time. A more cautious explanation could be that it's simply what happens when a state with strong authority decides to concentrate labor on a single, massive task. But it's possible that the practice of managing large crews had older roots built up through earlier projects, earlier dynasties, earlier communal builds that don't survive as clearly in stone. Now, for your quirky tidbit framed safely, a popular rumor claims that the workers were all slaves, or that they were forced in a way that makes the whole project feel like pure cruelty. This rumor is persistent in popular imagination, but it's not the dominant view among many modern scholars, especially given the evidence for worker settlements and provisioning. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Ancient labor systems could be harsh, and there's no need to romanticize them, but the archaeological picture often emphasizes organized labor with support structures rather than a simplistic everyone was a slave story. To be clear, this is debated in details and in how we interpret labor categories, but the mainstream picture is more nuanced than the rumor usually allows. You feel your mind start to relax again, because this version of the story is less about hidden chambers and more about daily life, and daily life has a sleepy rhythm to it. Wake, eat, work, rest, repeat. The pyramids rise not from a single miracle, but from thousands of boring days stacked together until they become history. You imagine the medical side too, because it's one of those details that makes the workers feel real. Archaeology suggests evidence of injuries and medical treatment in worker contexts, implying care for people who were valuable to the project. The evidence we do have points to a workforce that wasn't disposable in the simplest sense. If you're training skilled stoneworkers, you don't want them vanishing every month. You want them alive, healed, and back to work, which is the ancient version of employee retention. One interpretation is that this hints at a social contract labor in exchange for rations community and perhaps a sense of shared national or religious purpose. It's possible that people participated in these projects with a mix of obligation and pride. And what if when you stand under the pyramid's shadow, the real power you're sensing is not only the pharaoh's authority, but the collective capability of a society that learned how to cooperate at scale? Now, your third light joke slides in because the scene practically begs for it. You can picture the ancient equivalent of a lunch break where someone complains about the beer ration being too foamy, and someone else says, "Try hauling blocks all day, and you'll stop being picky." Honestly, human beings have probably been complaining about lunch for as long as lunch has existed. A fringe idea proposes that the workers' city and logistics network reflect the remnants of an even older organizational model, as if Egypt inherited a pre-existing system. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have still supports development within Nile Valley societies over time. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a softer, more grounded thought. Complex organization can feel sudden in history when the earlier stages are less visible archaeologically. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for claims of a fully separate, lost administrative civilization, the evidence is thin. But for the idea that skills and systems build over generations before they become monumental, the evidence and common sense support that more comfortably. You stand there in your mind at the edge of the workers' settlement and listen, not to secrets, but to routine. The clink of tools, the murmur of people, the crackle of fire, the steady breath of a civilization doing what civilizations do, organizing life around survival belief and work. And as you turn back toward the pyramids, the stones look slightly different. They look less like a riddle and more like a receipt, a record of human coordination written in limestone. It doesn't erase the mysteries, it just anchors them. It keeps the solid ground under your feet while you let the mist hover gently above it, harmless and calm. You keep walking, and the night starts to feel like it's smoothing the sharp edges of your thoughts, the way sand smooths a stone. The pyramids sit behind you now like giant patient backs, and the plateau around you feels full of quieter stories. Not the dramatic kind, the practical kind. The kind where history doesn't vanish, it just gets reused. Most historians agree that later periods in Egyptian history, and even later visitors, often reused older stone from monuments, temples, and pyramids. Archaeology suggests that high-quality limestone casing blocks were especially tempting because they were already cut, already dressed, already shaped into tidy rectangles that basically scream, "Please take me, I'm convenient." The evidence we do have points to centuries of quarrying, recycling, and repurposing that changed what the pyramids look like today. You picture the Great Pyramid in its original form, its outer casing, smooth and bright, reflecting sunlight like a pale mirror. What's broadly accepted is that much of that casing is gone now, and the rougher inner core is what you see. In some eras, people likely removed casing stones for construction elsewhere. It's not romantic, but it is very human. You have a city expanding, people needing building materials, and you have a giant pile of perfectly useful stone sitting there like an ancient hardware store with no security guard. One interpretation is that the loss of stones is also a kind of historical message. It shows you that monuments don't just endure nature, they endure people. A careful reading might suggest that the pyramids have lived multiple lives: royal tombs, sacred symbols, tourist attractions, and at times convenient quarries. It's possible that what we call damage is also evidence of continued cultural attention. People keep interacting with the site, reshaping it, pulling from it, and adding their own layer of history. Historians still argue whether the large-scale removal of casing stones happened gradually over many centuries, spiked during specific periods due to major building projects, or accelerated after major earthquakes and structural shifts made stones easier to access. That debate matters because it reminds you how much of the ancient world is shaped by later choices. The pyramids are old, but your view of them is also the result of everything that happened after they were built. You stop and look at the plateau again, and it hits you that reuse is not only physical, reuse is also mental. Skills, methods, rules, traditions, those get reused too. Archaeology suggests that building techniques evolve through practice, and the evidence we do have points to Egypt's early monumental architecture developing over time rather than appearing fully formed out of nowhere. That's mainstream safe, and it matters for tonight's theme. The more cautious explanation could be that the rule behind Giza is not a secret code, but a continuation of what already worked: measurement habits, labor organization, quarrying routines, and the architectural logic that gets refined across generations. And now you let the softer idea enter, carefully labeled as interpretation. One interpretation is that when you see the Old Kingdom's confidence, you may be seeing a long memory at work. It's possible that builders learned from earlier projects, carried forward lessons, and passed them down like an invisible toolkit. Not a lost civilization with supernatural knowledge, but a culture that learned, remembered, and improved. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that ancient societies reused materials constantly, and Egypt is no exception. The interpreted part is that ideas and methods are reused just as easily as stones. The imagined part is the cozy what if that a mason at Giza is using a trick his grandfather learned from a smaller tomb site who learned it from someone else. And the line keeps going back until it fades into darkness. You can almost hear the rhythm of it like a lullaby of craftsmanship. Measure, cut, check, haul, set, repeat. You've been hearing that rhythm in your head all night, and now it feels even calmer, because repetition is how humans make the world stable. Here comes your first light joke, because history is full of it if you listen gently. Imagine a later builder arriving centuries after the pyramids are built, staring at a casing block and thinking, this is already cut, this is already smooth, this is basically pre-assembled. Ancient convenience is still convenience. If there were an old-fashioned version of reuse, reduce, recycle, Egypt would have qualified. Now you let your attention drift toward the smaller evidence of reuse, the way a place accumulates scars that are also signatures. Stones moved, corners altered, surfaces changed. Archaeology suggests that later temples and buildings sometimes incorporated reused blocks from earlier structures because stone is valuable and time is short. The evidence we do have points to practical decisions. One interpretation is that reuse is also a kind of unintentional preservation. A block removed from one place might survive longer if it becomes part of a later building protected from erosion. It's possible that some stones from lost monuments survive precisely because they were stolen. That's a funny kind of immortality, but it happens. Second joke. Very gentle. If you've ever borrowed a pen from a coworker and it never returned to its original home, you already understand the ancient world's relationship with convenient objects. Only in this case, the pen is a multi-ton limestone block, and the coworker is a pharaoh. Same energy, bigger consequences. Now, because your mind likes a bit of mist, we allow one quirky tidbit framed safely. A popular rumor claims that the pyramids were once covered in inscriptions or secret messages that were later removed along with the casing stones. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for widespread lost casing inscriptions is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the rumor survives because it fits the emotional shape of the story people like to imagine, that a missing surface once carried missing answers. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The lack of surviving inscriptions on the exterior casing does not automatically imply there were secret texts that vanished. It could simply be that the design did not emphasize exterior writing in the way later monuments did, or that any surface details did not survive the long history of removal and erosion. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You keep walking and you notice how the idea of reuse helps your earlier questions feel calmer. It's not just that stones were taken, it's that time itself is a builder reshaping the meaning of what was built. The pyramids may have started as royal tombs tied to specific kings, but they became something larger in the human imagination, something that later generations used for their own purposes, whether practical or symbolic. What's broadly accepted is that Egypt's long history includes periods of great stability and periods of upheaval, and that monuments from earlier eras were sometimes repurposed or reinterpreted. Archaeology suggests that later Egyptians themselves engaged with the Old Kingdom past in complex ways, sometimes honoring it, sometimes reusing it, sometimes absorbing it into their present. The evidence we do have points to continuity and change living side by side. One interpretation is that this long relationship with the past might feed the feeling that something is older than Egypt. It's possible that when people say that they're responding to the way monuments outlast dynasties and outlast names, the stone stays, the paperwork disappears. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, especially the everyday decisions that never got written down. Now the third light joke arrives because you deserve one more before sleep pulls you deeper. Imagine the ancient equivalent of a city official saying, "We need building materials," and someone else replies, "Have you considered that giant triangle over there?" And the official says, "I love your initiative." History is often shaped by people who are aggressively practical. You pause and let the fan hum from your room. If it's there, blend with the imagined wind over Giza. You can almost feel the limestone cooling under starlight, and you realize that reuse is not only loss. Reuse is also a thread away the past reaches forward into later lives. The pyramids change, but they don't disappear. They keep being used, even if only as a source of questions. And the quiet, what if, settles in soft as dust. What if the oldest thing at Giza is not a secret chamber or a hidden civilization, but the human habit of building on what came before, using what's already there, learning what already works, reusing stones, reusing ideas, reusing the same sky to find north, the same rope to pull the same steady patience to make something last. You keep walking calm and slow, letting that thought hold you, the way the plateau holds the pyramids. Not as a conclusion, just as a gentle, believable possibility. You keep walking, and the plateau slowly releases its grip on your attention, like your mind is widening its view on purpose. The pyramids are still there behind you, still heavy and quiet, but now you start thinking about what it takes for a place like Giza to exist at all. Not just stone and labor, but connection. Because a civilization doesn't build in isolation. It trades, it borrows, it learns, it argues with its neighbors, then buys their timber anyway. Most historians agree that Old Kingdom Egypt was not sealed off from the rest of the ancient world, and archaeology suggests long-distance exchange networks existed for materials Egypt valued, especially things not easily found along the Nile. The evidence we do have points to contact with regions to the northeast, in the Levant, with Sinai for minerals like copper and turquoise, and with Nubia to the south for goods and routes that mattered over time. That's the solid ground. It's not a fantasy. It's the normal heartbeat of early states. You want resources, you build relationships or pressure routes, and the river carries your ambitions like it carries your boats. You picture a boat again because the Nile keeps showing up like the most reliable character in the whole story. A barge drifts under a low sun with cargo stacked neatly, not because it's pretty, but because if you stack it badly, you spend your afternoon fishing your supplies out of the water while your coworkers pretend not to know you. The evidence we do have points to river transport as a major advantage, and that advantage matters when you're building monumental projects that require not only limestone but also specialized materials and tools. Archaeology suggests that copper tools were essential in stoneworking, even if harder stone pounders did a lot of the heavy persuasion. Egypt had copper sources and access routes, including mining areas in Sinai, and the evidence we do have points to organized expeditions and resource management. Most historians agree that states often supported these expeditions with administrative planning, supplies, and security. And you can almost hear the ancient version of an email subject line, Sinai, Expedition Q2, please confirm attendance. Now your mind does the wider world thing. You think about wood. Egypt has palm and some local wood, but large straight timber suitable for big construction needs is limited. Archaeology suggests imported timber, including cedar from the Levant, played important roles in boat building and certain architectural needs across Egyptian history. The evidence we do have points to trade or acquisition networks that brought in resources Egypt didn't have in abundance. This isn't a hidden secret. It's a practical necessity. Even the most powerful kingdom can cannot conjure a forest out of the desert by believing hard enough. One interpretation is that when you see the pyramids, you're also seeing the invisible threads of exchange beyond Egypt's borders. A careful reading might suggest that technical knowledge also travels with goods. You ship timber, you ship copper, and along the way, you also ship ideas. It's possible that survey techniques, administrative habits, and craft practices were influenced by contact, not in a way that erases Egypt's achievements, but in a way that reminds you civilization is often collaborative across distance. And what if the rule you sense at Giza is partly a local tradition and partly a wider, ancient habit of measuring the world carefully shared and reshared by travelers who never expected their small tips and tricks to become part of a stone mountain? Historians still argue whether Egypt's earliest monumental building traditions developed mostly from internal Nile Valley evolution, or were significantly shaped by outside influences moving through trade and contact zones. That argument matters because it's tempting to turn outside influence into a dramatic takeover story. But influence can be quiet. It can be as simple as a visiting craftsperson showing a more efficient knot, or a trader explaining how another port organizes its storage. No thunder, no secret counsel, just practical ideas moving where people move. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Most mainstream explanations emphasize strong local development in Egypt, especially given the continuity visible from pre-dynastic communities into early dynasties and then into the Old Kingdom. But it's also reasonable to say that Egypt was part of a connected ancient world, and connected worlds tend to share techniques at the edges. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it doesn't require a separate civilization before Egypt to be interesting. You picture a marketplace near a river landing, not the cinematic kind with dramatic music, the noisy kind where someone is always bargaining like their life depends on it. Someone lays out copper ingots, someone offers resin oils, maybe exotic stones, maybe worked goods, and you realize trade is its own kind of architecture. It builds pathways that last longer than any one voyage. Here's your first light joke, because you deserve it. Imagine an Egyptian official inspecting imported cedar and trying to act unimpressed. But the second the trader turns away, he's like, okay, this is good wood. Ancient pride meets ancient practicality, and practicality always wins. Archaeology suggests Egyptian expeditions left inscriptions and records in various contexts, and what's broadly accepted is that the state kept track of resources and labor in ways that supported big projects. The evidence we do have points to administrators, scribes, and planners whose work is not as glamorous as lifting blocks, but is just as essential. Without them, your pyramid becomes a pile of stone and regret. One interpretation is that the stronger the bureaucracy, the more likely you can scale up innovation. It's possible that by the time Giza is built, Egypt has already developed a mature administrative culture capable of coordinating not only workers and food, but also supply chains that reach far beyond the plateau. And what if, when people imagine original builders as mysterious masterminds, the truth is more boring and more powerful? A society that learned how to count reliably, record reliably, and enforce routines reliably. Now for a gentle dip into the mist. A fringe idea proposes that certain distant cultures shared a single ancient blueprint of sacred geometry, and that monuments across the world reflect a coordinated plan from some lost source. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a single global blueprint is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the idea lingers because similarities across cultures can feel eerie at night when your imagination is soft and your eyes are half closed. A more cautious explanation could be that human beings faced with similar problems often arrive at similar solutions. If you want a stable, tall structure, pyramidal forms are a natural choice. If you want a calendar, you watch the sky. If you want to move stone, you use water and sledges. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm about the specific pathways ideas travel. Similarity can be shared influence, or it can be convergent thinking, or it can be a modern observer connecting dots that were never meant to connect. Second light joke, very sleepy. Convergent thinking is basically the universe saying, yes, you too will invent the same thing. Like when every human on Earth independently decides that putting snacks in a bowl is the height of culinary innovation. You keep walking, and you imagine the edges of Egypt, the desert roads, the mining routes, the river ports, the places where people from different regions meet and exchange more than goods. The evidence we do have points to contact zones where language, tools, and habits can mix. It's possible that some small technique at Giza has a cousin elsewhere, not because someone handed Egypt a secret, but because craftsmen are curious, and curiosity is contagious. Third light joke, because your mind is now fully in the ancient logistics, a relatable mood. Picture a trader arriving late and explaining, "Sorry, the wind was weird," and the official replying, "The wind is always weird. Some arguments never change. You breathe in slowly, you breathe out even slower." The pyramids are still behind you, but now they feel like the center of a web rather than an isolated miracle. Stone labor measurement and belief all sitting on top of routes that stretch beyond the horizon. And if you let the bedtime what if settle in, you can keep it gentle and safe. What if the civilization behind Giza is not only the people on the plateau, but also the people on the river, the miners in Sinai, the traders at distant ports, the woodcutters in far forests, the scribes counting sacks of grain, the sailors reading the stars? What if before Egypt means before the story is neatly packaged into dynasties, while the real foundation is a long buildup of connections and skills? You don't force that into a conclusion. You let it be an atmosphere. The plateau stays solid, the mist stays mist, and you keep moving forward through the night, calm, as a river current steady as a rope pulled hand over hand. You keep moving, and the farther you drift from the pure engineering questions, the more you notice something else clinging to the plateau like a second layer of sand. Stories, not the kind you can measure with a cubit, the kind that get repeated until they sound older than they really are. You feel it in the way the pyramids seem to attract narration like a magnet attracts filings. People come here and they don't just look. They explain. They decorate. They add meanings the way you add a blanket when the room feels too quiet. Most historians agree that many of the written accounts we have about Egypt and Giza come from sources written long after the pyramids were built, and archaeology suggests that later Egyptians themselves reinterpreted the Old Kingdom past through their own religious and political lenses. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth that's both comforting and annoying. The pyramids are older than most of the texts that describe them. So when you read later stories, you're often seeing a filter, not a direct window. You imagine a temple setting in a later period, centuries after Giza's stones were set. Oil lamps flicker. Priests recite scribes, copy, visitors ask questions. Someone wants a neat explanation, a name, a reason, a moral. And the priest, who is very practiced at speaking with authority, gives a story that fits the moment. Maybe it preserves a real memory, Maybe it reshapes a real memory. Maybe it fills gaps with symbolism that feels true, even if it isn't literal. One mainstream safe anchor is that ancient cultures often used myths to explain origins, legitimacy, and sacred landscapes. That doesn't mean the stories are useless. It means they operate differently than excavation and measurement. A careful reading might suggest that later narratives can preserve echoes of older realities while still altering details. It's possible that a myth holds the emotional outline of an event, even if it loses the timeline and the technical facts. And that's where the bedtime mystery settles in. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden truth, not a code, but a direction. A hint about what mattered to people who lived much later and still felt the pyramids were too huge to leave unexplained. Historians still argue whether later priestly traditions about Giza preserve authentic Old Kingdom memories or reflect later inventions and reinterpretations shaped by politics, religion, and the desire to impress visitors. That debate is so human, it almost makes you smile. Because of course people would upgrade the story. If you were guiding tourists through a monument older than your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, you'd probably get creative too. Not necessarily to deceive, but to make meaning, to make the past feel organized. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When later sources disagree or sound dramatic, it doesn't automatically mean anyone was lying. It may simply mean they were doing what humans do, turning complex history into a narrative that fits a listener's attention span. And attention spans have never been generous. Not now, not then. Especially not when your sandals are full of sand and you just want a good story. You keep walking, and your mind starts sorting information the way you've been sorting stone and mist all night. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the pyramids existed as ancient wonders for much of Egypt's own long history, and later generations interacted with them as already ancient objects. The interpreted part is how we read later stories as reflections of cultural needs. The imagined part is the hush of a temple storyteller leaning in, lowering his voice, adding a detail because the listener's eyes look sleepy and impressed. Here comes your first light joke. Imagine a visitor asking, "How did they build it?" And the priest pausing like a modern customer support agent, then replying with the ancient equivalent of, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" Not because he's mean, but because sometimes the real answer is too long and nobody wants the full lecture. Now, a mainstream, safe anchor you can hold is that writing and record keeping were central to Egyptian administration, but the survival of records depends on material. Papyrus doesn't last like limestone. Archives can be lost to time, water fire, reuse, and plain old neglect. The evidence we do have points to a world where plenty was written, but only some survived. That reality creates a wide space where later storytelling grows. One interpretation is that the absence of detailed Old Kingdom construction, accounts in the surviving record, invites myth. It's possible that people later looked at the pyramids and assumed there must have been secret knowledge because they didn't have access to the ordinary paperwork that once explained mundane logistics. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, especially when the missing pieces would have been the most boring pieces, supply lists, schedules, and the ancient equivalent of "please stop losing the measuring rod." Second light joke. Picture an ancient scribe labeling a scroll. Important ramp notes, then misplacing it, and 4,500 years later, you're still awake at night wondering what was on it. History is often shaped by someone putting something in the wrong pile. You start noticing how myths can be both helpful and hazardous. Helpful because they show you what later people believed mattered: sacred kingship, divine order, cosmic connection. Hazardous because a myth can sound like a technical report if you don't read it carefully. If someone says, the gods guided the stones, that may be a spiritual claim about legitimacy, not a literal description of levitation. The language of religion and the language of engineering can overlap in a way that confuses modern ears. A more cautious explanation could be that many mystery narratives are simply symbolic framings of real human work. The pyramids might have been seen as stairways to the sky, and that symbolism could coexist with practical labor. Ancient people were perfectly capable of believing a monument was sacred, while also knowing exactly how many hands it took to move a block. Human beings contain multitudes. They always have. Now, for your quirky tidbit framed safely, a popular rumor claims that secret temple archives preserve detailed pyramid building instructions that were later hidden or destroyed. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a dramatic intact how-to manual being concealed is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the rumor sticks because it's emotionally satisfying. It suggests the answer exists somewhere complete and tidy, instead of being scattered across fragments and inference, like an ancient jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still serve a gentle function tonight. It reminds you that record loss is real. It also reminds you that humans hate uncertainty so much, we'll invent a missing book just to feel better about not having one. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's reasonable to think there were records we no longer have. It's not reasonable to claim we know exactly what those records said. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You imagine a later era guide leading visitors along the plateau, pointing dramatically, saying the pyramids were built in some impossibly short time, or by forces beyond the ordinary. The visitors gasp because gasping is part of the experience. The guide smiles because he has bills to pay, spiritually speaking. And you in your modern bed recognize the mechanism. People sell wonder. People trade wonder. People use wonder to teach lessons. Sometimes the lessons are moral. Sometimes they're political. Sometimes they're just entertaining. Third light joke. If you think modern tour guides can exaggerate, just remember the ancient version didn't even have to worry about someone fact-checking on their phone mid-sentence. That's a level of freedom we can only dream about. And frankly, it's probably why the stories got so spicy. But you don't have to reject the stories to stay responsible. You can hold them like lantern light, real illumination, but not daylight. Myths show you what people felt. Archaeology shows you what people did. Most historians agree that both matter as long as you don't mix them up. And that brings you back to tonight's larger question, still calm, still unforced. The pyramids were built in Old Kingdom Egypt, solid ground. Yet the stories around them grew for thousands of years, mist. And sometimes that mist makes the past look older than it is, or different than it was, because the human mind prefers a grand narrative to a filing cabinet. So you walk on with a quiet clarity. The pyramids don't need secret scrolls to be astonishing. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in that space, stories bloom, some faithful, some embellished, all revealing something about the people who told them. Your steps remain slow, your breathing remains steady, and the desert, as always, listens without correcting anyone. You keep gliding forward, and the stories you just heard in your mind start to thin out, like smoke carried away by a steady breeze. In their place comes something quieter, almost clinical, but still strangely dreamy. The idea that history can be erased not by villains, but by weather, by time, by the slow, patient habits of water, wind, and shifting ground. Most historians agree that climate and environment have always shaped human settlement patterns in North Africa, and archaeology suggests the Sahara has not always been as dry as it is today. The evidence we do have points to long-term climate shifts with wetter periods in earlier millennia and gradual drying trends over time. That's the mainstream anchor. It doesn't need drama. It's simply the Earth doing Earth things, rearranging where people can live, farm, and move. Now you're standing on a plateau that feels dry enough to preserve a stone mountain, but not necessarily dry enough to preserve everything else. Mud brick decays, wood rots, textiles vanish. Even human footprints disappear in a single windy afternoon. So when you wonder about evidence of a civilization before Egypt, you have to hold two truths at once. Some evidence can survive beautifully, and other evidence can vanish like it was never there. One interpretation is that environmental change can create the illusion of missing chapters. A careful reading might suggest that earlier communities could have existed, moved, and left traces that are now difficult to detect, especially if their materials weren't durable and their settlements were later built over. It's possible that the pre-dynastic landscape had more activity than the surviving record can neatly show, simply because the record is uneven. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and the environment is one of the biggest reasons confirmation gets hard. Historians still argue whether major cultural transitions in Egypt's deep past were driven more by internal social development or by environmental pressures that pushed communities to reorganize along the Nile. That debate matters because it shapes how you imagine the buildup to the Old Kingdom. If environment pressures people into tighter zones, cooperation and conflict both intensify. If the Nile becomes the central artery, the state becomes more likely. And it's not a stretch to say that monumental building becomes easier when people are concentrated, governed, and supplied through a stable river system. Now, this is the section where the rumor shelf tries to jump off the wall and land in your lap, because the idea of environmental erasure is fertile ground for big theories. A fringe idea proposes sudden catastrophic resets, massive floods, global collapses, and lost civilizations wiped clean, leaving only a few stone survivors. This theory isn't widely accepted in the extreme form people sometimes present, and the evidence for a single worldwide erase and restart event that neatly explains everything is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, it persists because it feels like a tidy explanation for messy gaps. A more cautious explanation could be that many smaller disruptions and long-term shifts can produce the same feeling of loss. River channels change, settlements move, sand advances, wet periods end, trade routes reroute, people adapt, records break, layers get buried. It's less cinematic than a single dramatic collapse, but it fits how landscapes usually behave over long time scales. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Environment can erase evidence without erasing people. A community can relocate and leave little behind, and later archaeologists might only find hints. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it's the kind of possibility that keeps historians careful with grand claims. You picture the Nile changing course, slowly meandering over centuries, cutting new channels, abandoning old ones. You picture a settlement that once sat near water, becoming inland, then becoming a patch of dust. Archaeology suggests ancient waterways and channels can shift, and the evidence we do have points to human settlement patterns responding. So when you ask what came before, you're not always asking about who existed. You're sometimes asking about where evidence ended up. Here comes your first light joke, because the planet's slow habits deserve one. If Earth had a hobby, it would be redecorating. Constantly, quietly. without consulting anyone. You build a town, Earth moves a river, and suddenly your waterfront property is a walking distance from water. The ancient equivalent of that must have been deeply irritating. Now you let the idea of flood mythology drift in carefully. Most historians agree that flood stories are common across many cultures, and archaeology suggests real floods and river events can become mythic narratives over time. The evidence we do have points to the Nile's importance and its potential for destructive flooding in some conditions. One interpretation is that some myths preserve memory of real events, but expand them into cosmic stories. A careful reading might suggest that flood can be a symbol for chaos renewal or divine judgment, rather than a literal, global event. And what if in a gentle bedtime way you consider that flood narratives might also arise because water is one of the few forces that can truly reshape a human world fast enough for memory to notice. A storm, a surge, a ruined harvest. The kind of disruption that becomes a story told to children so they remember to build higher next time. That's an imagined mood note, not a conclusion. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Second light joke, if your entire civilization depends on a river, you probably develop a complicated relationship with it, like I love you and please stop doing that at the same time. The Nile is basically the most important roommate in history. Now bring your mind back to Giza, because you might wonder how this connects to the plateau itself. The plateau is high, stable, and made of stone. It's the opposite of fragile, so it survives. But fragile evidence around it may not. Campsites, temporary roads, wooden structures, storage pits, everything that supports a monumental build can disappear while the monument remains. That can create a weird illusion. The big thing looks like it appeared out of nowhere because the supporting world dissolved. One interpretation is that this is where the civilization before Egypt idea gains emotional power. When you don't see the gradual steps, you imagine a leap. It's possible that the gradual steps were real, but they left fewer traces. A more cautious explanation could be that Egypt's early development included many stages we partially understand, and some stages we understand poorly simply because their material culture wasn't built to last millennia. Now, for your quirky tidbit framed safely, a popular rumor claims the Sahara hides buried cities under dunes, entire worlds swallowed by sand. This rumor isn't always wrong in the broad sense that sand can bury sites, but the dramatic versions often run ahead of evidence. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the idea is emotionally true. In one way, deserts are excellent at hiding things. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The desert can preserve and conceal at the same time. Sometimes it protects sites by covering them. Sometimes it destroys them by abrasion and shifting. Archaeology works in that tension, and that tension makes gaps feel mysterious. Third light joke. Archaeology is basically the world's slowest scavenger hunt, except the clues are buried, the map is missing, and the person who hid everything did it 4,000 years ago and then forgot where they put it. Which is honestly a mood. You keep walking, and your thoughts start to soften. The idea of catastrophe becomes less important than the idea of uncertainty. A puzzle doesn't have to be a conspiracy. A gap doesn't have to be a cover-up. Sometimes a gap is just what time does. And yet you allow one last gentle what if, because sleep welcomes that kind of floating question. What if the reason we can't fully explain every detail of Giza isn't because the truth is hidden, but because the supporting evidence was never meant to survive this long? What if we're looking at the stone survivor of a broader world that included countless fragile things: reed boats, mud brick houses, wooden ramps, rope roads, temporary camps. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that climate and time reshape landscapes and evidence. The interpretation is that missing evidence can make development look sudden. The imagination is the image of older footsteps, older camps, older work songs lost under layers of sand, while the pyramids remain like fixed stars on the horizon. You slow your pace even more. The wind sounds softer. The plateau feels patient. And you realize the most sleep-friendly truth of all: you don't have to solve the whole mystery to appreciate it. You just have to sit with it steady and calm, letting the known stay known, and letting the unknown stay peaceful. You keep walking, and the night feels like it's trimming your thoughts down to their essentials. The pyramids are still behind you, but now they're less a single set of monuments and more the peak of a long ridge of history you can barely see in the dark. You start thinking about continuity, that slow building idea that keeps showing up like a familiar scent. The scent of limestone dust, the scent of bread smoke, the scent of human practice repeated until it turns into tradition. Most historians agree that Egypt's civilization did not appear fully formed overnight, and archaeology suggests a gradual development from pre-dynastic communities into early dynastic states and then into the Old Kingdom. The evidence we do have points to a long timeline of settlement craft specialization, social complexity, and political unification along the Nile. This is the solid ground, and it's the most important thing to keep under your feet when you're tempted by dramatic lost civilization explanations. Because here's the paradox: the mainstream story is already big, it's already strange, it's already impressive. People along a river over many generations build up the tools, the knowledge, the bureaucracy, and the belief systems that eventually allow them to build a stone mountain. You don't need an outside civilization to make that feel wondrous. The wonder is in the accumulation. One interpretation is that when people talk about before Egypt, they may be sensing the difference between a lived reality and a recorded label. A careful reading might suggest that Egypt as a formal state is the result of earlier Nile Valley cultures and networks that existed before the dynastic story becomes neat. It's possible that the original builders of Giza were heirs to these earlier traditions, drawing on practices that were already old in their own time. Historians still argue whether the key driver of Egypt's early state formation was primarily political consolidation through elites and institutions, or broader economic and environmental pressures that pushed communities into tighter cooperation along the Nile. That debate doesn't change the basic picture of gradual development, but it shapes the emphasis. Either way, the buildup is long, and a long buildup is exactly what you would expect if you're trying to explain something as enormous as Giza without resorting to magical shortcuts. You pause and imagine the pre-dynastic Nile Valley at night. Smaller settlements, less stone, more mud brick, more reeds, more wood. You can hear insects water and human voices closer together. The tools are simpler but not primitive in the insulting sense. They are appropriate. People know their seasons. They know the river. They know how to build, how to store grain, how to craft, how to trade. Archaeology suggests pre-dynastic societies had craft specialization and long-distance exchange, and the evidence we do have points to developing social hierarchies and regional centers over time. Now you shift back to Giza and feel how those earlier habits could become the roots of later monumental choices. Measurement doesn't start with pyramids, administration doesn't start with pyramids, religion doesn't start with pyramids. The pyramids are a loud expression of older things. One interpretation is that the rule at Giza, the sense of consistent planning, might be the culmination of a long educational tradition, not a single genius moment. It's possible that survey techniques, unit standards, and construction organization matured gradually. A more cautious explanation could be that by the Fourth Dynasty, the state was simply strong enough to apply these tools at an unprecedented scale. But the tools themselves likely had a past. Here comes your first light joke, because continuity is funny if you squint. Think of it as the ancient version of corporate knowledge. Someone in a pre-dynastic workshop learns the best way to lash a sledge, and 3 centuries later, someone at Giza is still doing it, and nobody knows why, but they'll fight you if you suggest a new knot. The evidence we do have points to earlier pyramid building experiments in Egypt before the Great Pyramid, including changes in design and technique across successive projects. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid didn't come out of nowhere. It came after a sequence of earlier royal tomb constructions that show experimentation and refinement. Archaeology suggests evolving approaches to slope angles, internal chambers, and casing methods across these earlier builds. This is mainstream and incredibly helpful because it shows you a learning curve in stone. A careful reading might suggest that impossible leaps are often just the moments we notice the curve. The curve exists before the leap. You just didn't have enough light to see it. Now, because the channel is sleep-friendly, you let yourself hold a calm, cinematic what if, without letting it harden into certainty. What if some of the earliest steps of this learning curve happened in places we haven't fully excavated, or in materials that didn't survive? What if the first versions of certain techniques were tested on smaller projects, or in perishable contexts like timber frameworks or mud brick ramps? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. A fringe idea proposes that Giza was built on top of an inherited blueprint from a vanished pre-Egyptian civilization, and that the Old Kingdom merely adopted it. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the strongest evidence still supports indigenous development over time within the Nile Valley cultural trajectory. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for the claim of a fully separate lost civilization handing Egypt a complete plan, the evidence is thin. But here's the thing. You can absorb the emotional appeal of that theory without accepting its literal claims. You can treat it as a metaphor for continuity, because the feeling of inheritance is real. The builders of any great monument inherit tools, habits, and ideas. They inherit landscapes and supply routes. They inherit myths and expectations. Even modern builders inherit building codes, and they complain about them with a sincerity that could power a small city. Second light joke. If you think ancient builders didn't grumble about regulations, imagine the ancient equivalent of a measurement standard being updated and everyone saying, "Oh great, now we have to redo the whole plan. Nothing changes." Now let's keep your footing on the documented side again. Archaeology suggests that the Old Kingdom state could mobilize labor and resources effectively. And the evidence we do have points to administrative sophistication that supports long-term projects. This doesn't mean everything was perfectly smooth. It means there was capacity, there were systems, there were people whose entire job was to make sure the bread arrived when the workers did. One interpretation is that once a state reaches that level, monumental building becomes a demonstration of power and order. It's possible that pyramids served as political statements as much as religious ones, proof that the king and his administration could coordinate the world. And what if that's the rule you can't fully explain at first glance? Not a math constant, not a star map, but the rule of organization itself. You look at the pyramids in your imagination and see them as frozen schedules, frozen resource flows, frozen social systems. The stones are the final shape, but the hidden structure is the civilization that can make that shape happen. Now your quirky tidbit arrives gently. A popular rumor claims that there are missing dynastic chapters, that the timeline is wrong by thousands of years, and that Giza belongs to a far earlier era. This rumor is not widely accepted, and the evidence we do have generally supports the Old Kingdom, dating through multiple lines of archaeological context. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for extreme timeline revisions, the evidence is thin in the way it usually needs to be thicker to carry the weight of the claim. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Questioning details and exploring open questions is healthy. Rewriting entire chronologies requires extraordinary consistent support across many independent lines of evidence. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it remains far from mainstream acceptance. Third light joke. It's like trying to change the date on every calendar in the world because one clock in your kitchen seems a little fast. You might be right about the kitchen clock, but you probably don't need to overthrow time itself. You keep walking and your thoughts grow calmer again. The idea of continuity is soothing. It means the past isn't a sudden cliff. It's a slope like the pyramid's face itself, rising gradually from small stones to big ones, from simple systems to complex ones. And now, as you approach the end of this section's drift, you let a quiet conclusion hover without snapping shut. What's broadly accepted is that Giza was built by Old Kingdom Egyptians with practical tools, skilled labor, and powerful organization. One interpretation is that this power drew on deeper, older traditions of craft and planning that existed long before the most famous monuments. And what if the original builders are best understood not as a mysterious outside group, but as the inheritors of a long Nile Valley apprenticeship, a civilization learning itself into existence? You don't force the question tighter than the evidence allows. You just let it breathe. Let it be a puzzle, an open question, a debated interpretation. And you keep walking into the night slower now, as if the desert is gently lowering the volume of everything but your breath. You keep walking, but it's less walking now, and more drifting. Like your mind is a boat that has stopped fighting the current. The plateau feels farther away, even if it's still right there in your imagination, and the pyramids feel quieter than ever. Not because they've changed, but because you have. Your thoughts have slowed. Your need for a single answer has softened. The night is doing what it always does best, turning sharp questions into gentle shapes. Most historians agree that the Giza pyramids were built in Egypt's Old Kingdom by a complex society capable of large-scale organization, and archaeology suggests practical tools, skilled labor, and strong administration made the work possible. The evidence we do have points to human ingenuity rather than impossibility. That's the solid ground you can fall asleep on because it's steady and it doesn't demand you solve anything. And yet the puzzle remains because the story still has blank spaces. Historians still argue whether certain details of Giza's planning reflect purely Fourth Dynasty solutions or a deeper inheritance of techniques and landscape knowledge that began earlier and became refined over generations. That debate is the soft hum in the background, like your fan, like your breath, like the desert wind. It doesn't have to be loud to be real. One interpretation is that when people say evidence of a civilization before Egypt, they may be describing a feeling more than a proven claim. The feeling that the monuments are the visible crest of a much older wave. A careful reading might suggest that before Egypt can mean before the clearest written record, before the grand stone receipts, before the dynastic labels that make history feel clean. It's possible that the builders of Giza were not the first to measure the sky, not the first to cut stone, not the first to organize labor, but the first to combine all of it at such a breathtaking scale. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a peaceful idea, not a hidden truth, not a conspiracy, just continuity. The way skills accumulate, the way societies learn, the way a river teaches the same lesson every year until an entire culture can recite it in stone. Now for your quirky tidbit, one last time, framed safely, a popular rumor claims the pyramids were built by outsiders, by visitors, by beings not quite human, because the idea feels dramatic and satisfying. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points far more strongly to Old Kingdom Egyptians building with local methods and evolving traditions. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and in this case, it is thin in the way rumors often are. Still, the rumor teaches you something true about the human mind. When we meet a monument bigger than our imagination, we expand the story until it fits. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Wonder can coexist with reality. The pyramids don't need an impossible origin to be extraordinary. They are extraordinary because human beings did them with limited technology and enormous determination. You glance back at the pyramids in your mind, and you can almost see the invisible systems again. The quarry routes, the river barges, the rope teams, the ration lists, the scribes, the workshops, the nurses treating injuries, the surveyors checking north with a plumb line swinging gently in the night. That plumb line has been your quiet companion all script long. A simple tool reminding you that gravity is the same in every era. Here comes your final light joke, because you deserve to smile before you sleep. Imagine the ancient supervisor finishing the project and saying, "Great work, team, next quarter, we'll do it again," and everyone pretends not to hear him. Some jokes don't even need translation. And now the story begins to settle into its ending posture. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the Old Kingdom context, the evidence for organized labor, the archaeological traces of planning and supply. The interpretation is the idea of inherited craft traditions and older landscape familiarity. The imagination is the hush of earlier footsteps on the plateau, older camps, older work songs lost to time, but not impossible, because people have lived along that river for a very long time. What's broadly accepted is that we will probably never recover every detail. Records vanish, materials decay, landscapes change. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And that's not a failure. It's simply how deep time works. You stop in your mind where the plateau meets open desert, and you listen. There's no big reveal, no thunder, no secret door opening with a cinematic groan. Just wind moving over stone. Just a horizon holding its line. Just the quiet truth that the past is both sturdy and fragile at once. Wind down. Now let the questions loosen their grip a little, the way your hands loosen when you finally set something heavy down. You don't have to carry the full weight of Giza into sleep. You can let the pyramids remain what they are, in the dark, steady silhouettes. Patient geometry, a reminder that humans have always reached upward, even when the world around them was rough and uncertain. Your mind can keep the solid ground, the simple facts that most historians agree on, and it can let the rest drift into soft possibility, because sleep is not a courtroom, and you are not on trial for not solving archaeology tonight. Picture the plateau one last time, but gentler now. The stones are cooler, The edges blur slightly in the moonlight. The desert wind moves like a slow breath, and it carries that faint, imaginary scent of limestone dust, of distant smoke, of a river you can't see but can feel in the story. Somewhere in that wind, you can almost hear the rhythm of labor and logistics turned into something soothing. Pull pause, breathe, repeat. Not as strain, but as a lullaby. And if a what if floats through your mind, let it float like a cloud, not a conclusion. What if the greatest rule of Giza is simply this: people learn, and then they learn again, and then they build something that outlasts the names of the people who built it? The pyramids don't demand you decide between certainty and wonder. They offer both, and they ask only that you look softly and then rest.